Hi everyone, and welcome to the Star Wars Reading Club book review of Star Wars Catalyst, a Rogue One novel by James Luceno. And I think what I'll do right out of the gate, I won't mince words at all. This one is probably my favorite canon novel out of the ones that I've read. I think in the position before I would probably put A New Dawn by John Jackson Miller, with Tarkin potentially being not too far behind that one. But without a doubt, this was definitely my favorite canon novel that I've read at this point. And I have to be honest, it doesn't have too many reveals or, moments like the other novels had. I would say that the Aftermath series had a little bit more of a grandiosity to it, just in the sense of revealing different things about the Star Wars universe. But I think with this novel, James Luceno had a pretty specific and insular goal of demonstrating just how the Death Star project came into being and how it got to where it was eventually by A New Hope. And not only that, but also to introduce the characters that we'll see down the road with the upcoming film, Rogue One. So I think that it succeeds very well at those goals. And I mean, James Luceno is a personal favorite author of mine. And I wasn't surprised that this novel was just very well written. The plot and the story was extremely tight. And I just have to, tip my hat to James Luceno. He's such a good author, very inspiring. But I have to admit as well that I don't have too much of a knowledge of the film Rogue One at this point. I've kind of kept myself away from looking at too much of the details that have come out, although I have watched the trailers at this point, so that might affect my reading of the novel just a little bit, and also this review. I hope that some of the things haven't come out and my interpretations are wrong, but nonetheless, I have a very limited knowledge of the film at this point, but that will probably change because this novel has definitely pumped me up for the upcoming film. And I was just going to put it out there at the beginning. I'll probably do a live hangout just in regards to this novel, just because I think that there's so much to discuss and a lot of questions now leading up to the film that's going to be released next month. So I think it makes sense to do another live hangout and discuss this novel, because I think it will help me as well just to understand a couple of different things with the upcoming film. But nonetheless, this is an excellent novel. Again, too, definitely recommend it for anyone who's a fan of Star Wars. And it's probably my favorite canon novel at this point. And just like with the Ahsoka novel that came out last month, I didn't really know what to expect with Catalyst. I thought that maybe we were going to see a timeline that was closer to A New Hope, and maybe we would see some of the characters that would be in the movie Rogue One. And we'd see a lot of Jyn Erso and Saw Gerrera. But I was actually pretty shocked, just like I was with Ahsoka, with the novel Ahsoka, that the timeline starts 1 year into the Clone Wars. So we're actually a very far distance from what is probably going to happen in the film Rogue One. But I could be wrong with that also. But I think the timeline, we're looking at 1 year into the Clone Wars, and then I would have to say that it ends roughly 3 years into the Empire. So I think it covers a distance of about 5 or 6 years, and I'll get into a little bit why I think it ends 3 years into the Empire, just when we discuss my favorite part of the novel with Tarkin. But let's start by discussing some of the primary characters from the novel. Because it starts 1 year into the Clone Wars, we don't really see much of Jyn Erso. She's only a toddler and child throughout the novel. So the primary characters are her parents, Galen Erso and Lyra Erso. But just with Galen, just her father Galen to start, I really like this character. I thought that he was extremely well written, and his story is that basically he's a genius, and his field of study is crystallography and energy enhancement. So within a novel where the Empire, and really the Republic, as we'll get into in just a moment here, when you're trying to build a huge super laser using kyber crystals, as you would imagine, somebody who's working within the field of crystallography and energy enhancement is going to be pretty important to the entire project. So Jin's father, Galen Erso, he becomes a critical component of the Death Star project, eventually named Project Celestial Power, which I thought was an excellent name. And he becomes so critical to the Death Star project because he's researching how to use kyber crystals, first synthetic ones during the Clone Wars, because the Jedi, I think as we discussed in the Ahsoka novel review, the Jedi have a monopoly on all kyber crystals within the galaxy. So he's at first researching on synthetic crystals, and then after the war, once the ban and really the monopoly of the Jedi is lifted, he can actually start working with real kyber crystals. So all of that was very well written. It was really, it wasn't science heavy, but there was a lot of interesting science within the novel. And if that's something you enjoy, then I think you're going to love it, because I definitely enjoyed it myself. But he's researching how to use the crystals initially to generate raw power that could be harvested and stored and delivered to needy worlds. So his research is really to develop something that has good intentions, but then obviously as the Empire starts building its Death Star project, they want to try to bring him in to weaponize that research. But I really liked Galen Erso. I felt bad for him at a lot of points throughout the novel. He's really stuck in this position where he's a pacifist, and maybe not so much a pacifist, but at least a conscientious objector to the war. He really wants nothing to do with the war, the Clone Wars at first, with the Republic, and is really just working with corporations to try to develop his initial research, which has good intentions. He doesn't want anything to do with the Clone Wars at first, and then is really dragged into the whole project by Orson Krennic to try to weaponize his research without him knowing. But I think at this point it's a good point to introduce the character and discuss Orson Krennic, who again, like Galen Erso, I thought was extremely well written. It was hard at different points to know exactly what his sort of motivations were. I didn't know if he was just somebody who was looking to climb the chain in the hierarchy within the Republic at first, and then within the Imperial Empire. But really, I think you start to see that it is a lot more nefarious than what it seems. And by the end of the novel, he's definitely a key villain. But anyway, with Krennic, he's originally part of the Special Weapons Group that was part of the Death Star project under the Republic. And we'll get into how that sort of came about, where the Death Star was actually being built by the Republic first. But he's within the Corps of Engineers, and there's a lot of different subsets and groups out there. It's difficult to keep track of them, but basically he's in the Corps of Engineers and part of the Special Weapons Group that's working on building the Death Star. And right from the beginning, very ambitious, wanting to move up in the world, he understands right away that Galen Erso is his ticket up the chain of command within the Imperial hierarchy. So a lot of the early novel is Krennic trying to persuade and push Galen into working on the Death Star project. But again, he's not really making it well known to Galen that his research is going to be weaponized. He's trying to get Galen to tap into the full raw power that he can pull out of and use from the kyber crystals. But there's a nice background that's established within the novel as well, which will probably be important within the film of Rogue One. But Krennic and Galen Erso, they have a relationship that dates back into their program. It's called the Futures Program, which I think was for gifted students. So both of them had initially met there, and really the whole story is set up with Krennic orchestrating the rescue of Galen Erso from his imprisonment on a planet named Valti. And again, right at the beginning of the novel, Galen and his wife Lyra are trying to use his research to try to use it for good purposes with energy. But that world becomes taken over by the Separatists, and Galen becomes imprisoned, which works to Krennic's advantage because he can then rescue Galen and then try to hold it over to him as if he's indebted to him, that Galen is indebted to Krennic for rescuing him. But basically what happens is eventually Krennic is able to get Galen to try to develop his research into trying to harness the full amount of raw energy and power that he can pull from the kyber crystals. But I do like that James Luceno doesn't make it easy. It does take a lot of persuasion and coaxing from Krennic to push Galen into trying to, he not weaponizing it, but at least trying to pull as much power from the crystals as he can. And really it took a lot of Krennic trying to say that there's anarchists in the galaxy that are threatening the Empire. We have to keep the stability and integrity of the Empire protected. And then pretty much Galen just becomes bored. He really needs a project that he's working on. He's such a genius that he can't just be left in the wind to his own devices. And then he also gets into debt. And then really Galen makes the decision that for the greater good, and particularly for his wife and his daughter, that he's going to work for the Empire and try to push his research forward. So I loved all of that. The two main characters of Galen Erso and Orson Krennic I thought were very well done, and it definitely sets up at least Krennic's story for Rogue One very nicely in my opinion. So there is a lot there with Galen and Krennic. They take up the majority of the novel, and we could talk a lot more about the back and forth of their relationship. But nonetheless, those were two really good characters to carry the novel, in my opinion. And I also really liked the character of Lyra Erso, who's Jyn Erso's mother, as you would imagine, and Galen's wife. I thought that she was a great counter to Galen in the novel, whereas Galen's more of the genius, mad scientist type. Lyra was she was more in tune with nature and not so much the science, although she was someone who helped Galen with his different projects. I thought she was an excellent counterbalance just to Galen from that perspective. But then also too, she's someone who could see the bigger picture, especially once Galen starts to get deeply committed into his research. And Lyra's really the one who starts putting the pieces together. So I thought that she was an excellent counter to Galen, but there was also something really interesting about Lyra, just with her, I don't want to say connection to the Force, because in my opinion she wasn't Force sensitive, although someone might disagree with me, because I thought that it was going into the direction that it would be revealed that Lyra was Force sensitive, which I was hoping wasn't the case, and I was glad to see that Luceno didn't take it there, mainly because I thought that it would be best if Jyn Erso in the upcoming movie isn't Force sensitive. But nonetheless, Lyra does seem to have an interesting connection to the Jedi, and perhaps the Force as well, just in the sense that she respects the Jedi, respects their practices, and definitely has a reverence for the Force itself. So I thought that that was interesting with Lyra, just that she wasn't a Jedi, obviously, and probably had no connection to the Force, but there was that sort of parts of the Star Wars universe that we all are so fond of. It was seen through her eyes, so somebody who wasn't Force sensitive. It was nice to get that perspective from someone outside of the Jedi Order. But excellent character. I really liked Lyra Erso. And with Jyn Erso, as you would imagine, there wasn't much of a role for her in the novel. Lyra is pregnant with Jyn at the beginning of the novel, so she's primarily just a toddler and young child growing up throughout the novel. So I thought that those were two excellent characters. Like I said, Lyra was a great counterbalance to Galen's character, and also somebody who was able to put the pieces together. And two characters that I think I'll talk about as well in this review. I really enjoyed these two characters as well. These were on an interesting side plot that I really enjoyed. Sometimes I'm not too fond of the side plots that show up in the Star Wars novels, but the characters of Obit and Saw Gerrera, I really enjoyed the relationship between them, and also just the overall arc that Obit goes through. So Obit's a smuggler, right along the lines of a Han Solo arc, I would say. Someone who starts out as someone who's helping Krennic, just with the tasks of the Empire, and then realizes that he's made a mistake and can't go through with it, and at the end of the day, he's a smuggler with a heart of gold. So I really liked the Obit character. I don't think that, if you guys are familiar with the actor Pedro Pascal, who's coming up in he'll be acting within the film Rogue One. I'm not sure exactly what his role in the film is going to be. That's something I've kind of steered clear of. But if you're familiar with him, the actor that is from Game of Thrones, he played Oberyn. And then also, if you've watched the series Narcos, he played Javier Pena in Narcos. That's basically who I was picturing Obit as being, but I don't think that that's who Pedro Pascal is going to be playing in the upcoming Rogue One film. I'm not sure if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty confident. I couldn't find anything connecting those two individuals, those two characters. And I think Obit's arc does come to a completion at the end of the novel. But I really liked their characters just in the sense that they really symbolized the Empire overreaching and taking control of worlds and really major corporations as well, and just destroying worlds because they're trying to mine entire worlds and destroy them in order to get resources to build the Death Star. And really, in doing that, they're igniting what would become the rebellion, not so much the rebellion as we come to know it by A New Hope and also in the TV series Rebels, but just really people pushing back and thinking that the Empire really isn't out there for good. It's something more nefarious. So I really like that storyline just because it symbolized people turning against the Empire. But more importantly as well, it really showed that at the beginning and early on in the Empire, I think that individuals within this galaxy were probably giving the Empire a little bit of a leeway in the sense that they were, I don't want to say happy that it came about, but they were willing to accept the Empire if it was going to end the Clone Wars. So I think initially somebody like Saw Gerrera even, who becomes a really forceful opponent of the Empire, and perhaps Obit more particularly, people like those, like them, were going to give the Empire a little bit of leeway and perhaps see how it went. But eventually the overreaching by the Empire, particularly in its destroying worlds to try to gather resources to build the Death Star, I think that that really symbolized for people that the Empire is more nefarious and is probably something that they need to oppose. So I really liked the characters of Haz Obit and Saw Gerrera. I did like that we got the introduction to Saw just within the novel, because we will see that character coming up in the film, played by Forrest Whitaker. So I was happy that we got the introduction to Saw in the novel. And maybe I'll start talking about some of the more interesting aspects of the novel that I found. And one of the more surprising parts of the novel, and perhaps I shouldn't have been too surprised, was just the fact that Palpatine and the Republic, had started building the Death Star secretly during the Clone Wars. And we're talking, they might have started building it within weeks or at least a couple of months after Attack of the Clones. And I only say I shouldn't be too surprised just because we do have that very interesting scene at the end of Revenge of the Sith where Tarkin, the Emperor, and Vader are looking out to a Death Star that is, it's nowhere near completion, but there is quite a bit of construction that's taken place already. But we don't know the timeline exactly. But nonetheless, it was interesting to see that there were rumors that the Separatists were also building a super weapon along the lines of the Death Star. And then so the Republic and Palpatine thought that they were in a position where they themselves had to also start building their own Death Star. That stuff, I thought that that was some of the more interesting aspects of the novel. It had a real Manhattan Project feel to it. And I really liked the whole aspect of, we didn't get any scenes with Dooku and the Emperor, but what we do see a lot with is the more civilian and military aspects of the Republic initially, and then later on with the Empire. So we don't see Palpatine and Dooku at all within the novel, but we do see the military and practical results of them playing both sides. So I thought that those were very interesting scenes in the novel. And yeah, really the Death Star, with 1 year into the war, they've already finished the ring of the Death Star. So the first ring which was, I believe it was 120 kilometers in diameter, that was already finished above Geonosis 1 year into the war. So it was interesting to see that very quickly, as soon as the Clone Wars started, the Republic was already building the Death Star, which of course was then taken on by the Empire. So I thought that that was a really interesting touch to the novel by James Luceno. And then it was interesting to see also that the plans for the Death Star and the research behind it. So I guess what we saw in Attack of the Clones, where we saw the projection by that was being held by Poggle, I believe it was. The research for the Death Star fell into the Republic's hands after the Second Battle of Geonosis. So it was interesting that we see that sort of tipped off an arms race, because the Republic was able to get their hands on the research, thinking that the Separatists were already starting to construct their own Death Star, and really it left no choice for the Republic at that point than to start their own Death Star project. So I thought that was a very nice touch, and then it was interesting to see it transfer over into the Empire, just in the sense that with the Republic, they wanted it because they were scared that the Separatists were going to have a super weapon. But then in the Empire, once the war had ended, they wanted it to be able to rule the galaxy through fear and also protect the integrity of the Empire. So I thought that was an excellent touch to the novel. As I stated before, it just was good to see the results on the civilian side of things, and I just mean with the non-Force users, no Jedi or the Sith, just to see the actual results of Palpatine and Dooku playing both sides. So I thought that was very nice to see. And just in speaking about nice touches, I thought that it was a good idea that James Luceno had no scenes with the Jedi, or really with either the Sith as well, insofar as the Emperor, Dooku, or Vader. I'm not going to lie, I was hoping that there was going to be a Darth Vader scene in the novel at some point, just because I thought that there would be an interesting connection with him and the Death Star. But at the end of the day, I think that it was a good idea to leave the Jedi out and also the Sith as well. It just showed more the civilian aspect of the Empire, which was critical. And I think that that's a major point as well. With all of the work that Palpatine and the Sith had done, it really was needed that there was the civilian aspect of the Empire. Just in that there was people within the galaxy who pretty much wanted the Empire as well. It couldn't have been just that Palpatine out of thin air created the Empire. There were people who were ready to transition from a republic into a more dictatorial government and have somebody rule the galaxy with the Empire. But just getting back to the Jedi, really when it came to the Death Star project, the Jedi had absolutely no influence on any of that. There was no Jedi on the secret committee that was overseeing the Death Star project. They're not even aware of the project or the fact that the Death Star is being built. Again, I don't think that that's surprising, and it shouldn't be, just given the fact that if the Jedi knew that was what was being created, they wouldn't have let that happen. And then it would also conflict with Obi-Wan's surprise in A New Hope, just at seeing the Death Star for the first time. So I thought that it was a really good idea to leave the Jedi out of, not have any hands involved in the Death Star project. Not just because it wouldn't have made sense. I mean, the Jedi wouldn't have went along with the Death Star, and it would have ruined the Obi-Wan surprise in A New Hope. But I think that it was key to focus on characters like Tarkin, as we'll see, like Krennic, other people within the hierarchy of the Empire. It was important to know that there was people who weren't Force users, who weren't connected to the Sith, that were pushing for the Death Star project to go forward. So I like that aspect. But what we did also see was we got some more reaction to the whole story behind the Jedi turning on the Republic and Palpatine. And I like that Luceno added that into this novel as well, because there was a brief mention of it in his novel Tarkin. So it was nice to see that there was some more focus on the whole, what did people think about what Palpatine was saying, that he was attacked by Jedi in his office, and that the Jedi were destroyed because they turned against the Republic. Just in that vein, Galen and Lyra did talk about it, and they didn't believe it. So at first I thought that it was going to be something more along those lines, where it was questioned a little bit more. But very importantly, in my opinion, Luceno did add in a couple of lines that whether or not... See, and this was my focus, wondering whether people believed it or not. But importantly, Luceno added in a couple of lines where he made it clear that people didn't really care whether or not it actually happened. It wasn't a debate for most people within the galaxy whether or not the Jedi did or didn't turn against the Republic. More importantly, for them, they just accepted it because they were so happy that the Clone Wars had come to an end. And I think it was something where, well, the Empire saved us from the Clone Wars. Let's just go along with the Empire, regardless of what happened eventually with the Jedi. And I think that that was a more important point to make, because it was interesting, at least in my mind, whether or not people were debating it and whether or not they would have moved or questioned Palpatine's authority as Emperor, based upon whether the Jedi turned or not. It was more important that they just accepted it because the Clone Wars ended and they're just going to go along with the Empire for that reason. And also, too, I like that, just in staying with the Jedi, Luceno did add in a couple of lines that in mere weeks, the Jedi Order passed into myth and history. So really nobody was questioning whether or not the Jedi had turned. They were going to just accept it and then move on, which is eventually what happened. So I did like the way that Luceno approached the Jedi in the novel. Another aspect of the novel that I really enjoyed was just all the information that we received just related to the actual building of the Death Star and just the incredible engineering feat that it ultimately was. I think that that was important just because if you look at the canon material, basically we just have it kind of showing up between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. And really it wasn't that easy for the Empire. It was actually very difficult, as you would imagine, for them to actually put it in all into, from theory into practice, and actually end up with the Death Star. And I like that Luceno, a lot of the technology that was involved with the Death Star, and this was more of the scientific and military aspects that I enjoyed about the novel, but a lot of the technology that existed with the Death Star, just in regards to its shields and the hyperdrive systems, a lot of those were adapted from the technology that already existed, just put on a much larger scale. But really, the main point of difficulty in the building of the Death Star was just the weapons system. There was nothing that existed at the time that they could use in regards to the super laser. And that really made the point that Galen's research was very important, and really just sets it up for why Krennic wants Galen to work on the weapons so badly. So I really enjoyed those parts of the novel, just in actually discussing the scientific and practical difficulties that they had to go through to actually end up with the Death Star. And the other interesting aspect that Luceno puts in the novel is just the fact that a lot of the scientists really weren't, I don't want to say they weren't committed to the Empire, but a lot of them just took on their roles because that's where the funding was, and that's really just, where scientists went during that time period. They were just going to move into the Empire and working for them. And really, at the end of the day, though, the scientists weren't going to be involved in creating a super weapon that could do so much damage. A lot of the scientists were actually good people who, had they known that they were actually building a super weapon, wouldn't have gone through with it. And really, Galen as well was one of those scientists. They all pretty much had to be kept in the dark. And really what Krennic was doing was he had thousands of facilities, and they were all placed on hundreds of different worlds. They were all doing little portions and little parts of building the Death Star, and then Krennic was organizing it all together to be able to weaponize it and then consolidate it into the Death Star project. So I really liked those aspects. I thought that it was interesting, just in thinking about it, would all those scientists really actually build a super weapon that would do so much destruction for the Empire? And at the end of the day, Luceno makes it clear that they all had to be kept in the dark of what was ultimately going on. But really, just in how the novel ended, at the end of the novel, they had used Galen's research to fire a test shot, but it was a test shot with the laser, that is. But it was really only on the small scale. I think Krennic had mentioned that they wanted to use the prototypes of that test firing and then build something 50 times larger. And it was interesting, the test firing as well. I think they said that it was the combined power of all the batteries of a Star Destroyer firing at once. So by the end of the novel, while they have test fired it, they still don't have the actual weapon that they need to be able to use with the Death Star. So I thought that that was a very good way to just leave where the technology was, because there's still at least 15 years, in my opinion, where they're going to have an actually fully functioning Death Star, particularly with the weapon. So I just thought that all the information that Luceno added, just in regards to the engineering feat that the building of the Death Star was, those parts of the novel were very interesting too. And just before talking about how the novel ends and where everyone leaves off, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say at least a little bit something about my favorite and probably most unexpected part of the novel, was just Tarkin's role and just how significant that role was in the novel. But in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have been too surprised, just given Tarkin's ultimate connection with the Death Star, and then just the fact that Luceno was authoring it as well. This is Luceno's second shot at writing Tarkin, and his scenes were very well written. A lot of them, I was laughing just how sort of close they were to the Tarkin from A New Hope, and just everything that we saw within the Clone Wars TV series. Everything was just Tarkin to a T. So I thought Luceno did very well with Tarkin, and his scenes were probably my favorite scenes in the novel. But it was interesting too. I thought that there was a bit of a funny point where Luceno kind of just nails Tarkin, and really we get a glimpse at just the character of Tarkin, just in the fact that it's mentioned that Tarkin is the one that's pushing Palpatine forward to move with the Death Star initially, which I'm not sure how much pushing Palpatine really needed, but just right from the beginning, Tarkin was the one pushing the Death Star project forward, and this was back when the Clone Wars was still going on. So even right at the beginning of the Clone Wars, Tarkin was the one who wanted the Death Star. And then also, too, he had a similar idea for a similar super weapon. So really, it seems almost inevitable that Tarkin would be the one who gains ultimate control of the Death Star. Luceno does a really good job, in my opinion, of just connecting those dots and really making it Tarkin's pretty much his destiny to be the one in control of the Death Star. So I really like those aspects. But there's a very nice competition that Luceno sets up between Tarkin and Krennic for complete control of the Death Star project. They're pretty much, I mean, not enemies, but they are rivals in trying to rise up the ranks of the Imperial hierarchy and really gain control of the entire Death Star project. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was once Tarkin finds out that Krennic is using Galen Erso, and Galen Erso is the one who's really the reason for most of Krennic's success in rising through the ranks of the Empire. Really, Luceno makes it clear, in my opinion at least, this is how I interpreted it, you could have easily seen a Grand Moff Krennic. Really, it wasn't set in stone that Tarkin was the one who was going to become Grand Moff. If Galen would have finished what he was setting out to do and was able to create the super weapon by tapping into the full power of the Kyber crystals, then Krennic was probably on his trajectory was to become the Grand Moff and probably oversee the entire Death Star project. However, Tarkin figures out Krennic's plans and throws a wrench into the entire sort of explosion through the ranks that Krennic is going through. And ultimately, Tarkin positions himself to take that position. So I really enjoyed those aspects. At the end of the day, for as much maneuvering as both of them are doing, they're both geniuses in my mind, I would say. But they're also very good strategists. It just happened at the end, Tarkin caught on to what Krennic was doing and was ultimately able to succeed him. But also, too, I'll just mention about Tarkin. Luceno does an excellent job, because I had some questions related to this. he does an excellent job of leaving off Tarkin on Sentinel Base, overseeing Krennic, and just the entire project that's being built, the Death Star project, over Geonosis. So it sets Tarkin up perfectly, in my opinion, for the events that were going to come in the novel Tarkin. So I really like that Luceno put him on Sentinel Base, and the reason that he's on Sentinel Base is to act as the overseer of Krennic, because there's questions about whether or not he can ultimately come through in the end. So I really liked Luceno putting, at the end of the novel, Tarkin on Sentinel Base, being in the exact position that he needs to be to ultimately take over the Death Star project. Great job with Tarkin by Luceno. But by the end of the novel, there are a lot of great questions, in my opinion, leading up to the film Rogue One. Basically what happens at the end are the Ursos find out that the Empire is ultimately weaponizing his research, and they're not using it to try to harness energy and then give it to needy worlds. They're using it to try to build some sort of weapon that could possibly destroy worlds. I mean, they're tapping in and trying to pull out as much power from the Kyber crystals as they can. But the Ursos figure out the Empire's plan. They're able to escape the facility that Galen was working in that had been built by the Empire for Galen to conduct his research. So they're on the run by the end of the novel. And importantly, Krennic will be looking for them. So that's something that I'm hoping that it gets resolved by the film Rogue One. I'm sure it will, because their paths are definitely intertwined at this point. But Krennic is demoted. He doesn't get to rise up through the ranks and take control of the Death Star project. He's actually demoted back down to lieutenant commander. And he's still in charge of the special weapons group still. So even though he's demoted and he's kind of looked down upon for having let Galen escape, he's still in charge of the special weapons group. So it'll be interesting to see how far he's able to progress through the ranks by the time of Rogue One. And importantly, Krennic is going to be looking for Galen, and we know that because even as he admits, the work on the super laser has stalled at this point. And as Galen knows and as Krennic knows, they're not going to be able to have a functioning Death Star, particularly with the super weapon, without the research and without the genius of Galen. So we do know that Krennic will be looking for the Ursos. And importantly as well, I'm very happy that Luceno put this in, because there will still be most likely at least a 15-year period between the end of this novel and possibly the Rogue One film, but at least A New Hope when they have a functioning Death Star. Luceno puts it in that they still have crystallographers and experts working on the Death Star. So it is still moving forward. It's not like without Galen, they're just scrapping the whole thing. But that said, they still need Galen in order to finish it. But I did like, too, that Galen thought it through and he didn't sabotage the entire project, and he didn't destroy all of his research because he didn't want the Empire to hunt him down and to hunt his family down. He just dropped out of the project, I think is how he put it. So that was great to see, because there was enough that he left that the Empire would still be able to build off on his research. But that said, I'm really looking forward to see what Krennic's next move would be, and if he eventually catches up with the Ursos by the time Rogue One comes, the timeline for Rogue One, or if maybe we see that happen in the movie, and then we see Galen finish off his research and allow the Empire to complete their Death Star project. And then also with Tarkin, again, he's on Sentinel Base, just looking to take control of the entire project eventually. So that was my review of Catalyst by James Luceno. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I definitely recommend this book. It is my favorite of the new canon novels, and I would definitely say that this was, in my opinion, the perfect introduction to the upcoming movie, Rogue One. I've been holding off on looking into the film more and past the trailers. I think at this point what I'll do is look into it a lot more, and I'm sure there'll be upcoming videos just related to Rogue One. But what I'll do for the next review, I think I've mentioned it a few times here now, and I think I mentioned it after the Ahsoka review, but I will be going back to Path of Destruction, the first novel in the Bane trilogy. I have started in on that novel, so it shouldn't take me too much longer. I did put it on hold, though, so I could read Catalyst and get this review out. But the next novel for review will be Path of Destruction, the first novel in the Darth Bane trilogy, which, as I mentioned after reading Darth Plagueis, is probably my favorite novel. And as I've been reading it, I think that it definitely still holds the top spot. So that novel will be next for the review. I hope you guys look forward to that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm always happy to hear what you guys think down in the comments section below. And as I mentioned, there's so much more to talk about with this novel, particularly with the upcoming film. If you guys want me to do it, then I'll definitely do another live hangout, and we can focus on the novel and the upcoming movie, and of course we can talk about anything Star Wars related. So just let me know about that in the comments section as well. But thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope you guys enjoy your upcoming weekend here, and I look forward to talking to you guys again soon.